Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in Politics and Polemics, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Megu. I also host my own podcasts, Independent Thought and Freedom, and also a story club, Global Politics and Global Cultures. Today, my guest is Spencer Critchely, author of the book Patriots of Two Nations, Why Trump Was Inevitable and What Happens Next, published by McDavid Media, out now. Welcome, Spencer.
Oh, it's good to be with you, Kirk.
All right. Yeah, well, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
To start off, what we like to do is have the author, yourself in this case, tell us about yourself, and in particular, in relationship to the subject of this book. So what's your background as it led you here?
Sure. Well, my background is in all different forms of media and communication. I actually started out as a songwriter and producer in the music business way back. But over the years, I've worked in journalism, interactive media in Silicon Valley, basically all forms of communication and I think all forms of media. And at a certain point, I started doing political communication consulting after getting interested in politics during the 2004 election, actually. And eventually that led me to working on both Obama campaigns, and I helped out a little with the Hillary Clinton campaign as well. And it was actually election night 2016, and I was as shocked as anybody else when Hillary lost to Donald Trump. That got me thinking along the lines that finally led to this book. I was trying to make sense of how we could have come to this point. And my research ended up taking me back to the founding of this country, and in my case, the writing of this book.
Right. It's interesting. You started off as a songwriter and producer. I'm very fascinated by the whole music industry, as I suppose many people are. How did you get into politics from that? Was it, I suppose there are tons of links between the music industry and politics, but I'd be interested to hear your story.
Sure. Well, it didn't seem to make much sense at the time. In retrospect, it does. I can see my whole life is based on communication in one form or another, where it's through music or journalism or writing or even computer code in some cases. I got into politics really almost by accident. A friend of mine invited me to help out the local Democratic Party here in Monterey County, California. And because he knew of my background in communication in all these different forms. And I was kind of holding my nose because, like a lot of people, I kind of assumed it was, politics was a seamy business full of power-hungry weasels, basically. Mm-hmm. And I was doing it really out of a sense of civic obligation. And to my surprise, I discovered some just terrific people who actually were pursuing public service for all the right reasons, including our local member of Congress at the time, Sam Farr, who became quite a mentor for me. And it struck me that here was an opportunity to apply my communication skills and the creativity that I had always been drawn to in connection with that, in a way that would actually make a difference for the world. So my volunteer work led to me being hired to work on Sam Farr's campaigns and some local elected officials' campaigns. And when the first time I saw one of my candidates get elected and know that a really good person had gotten elected, or that a school bond measure had been passed in one case that raised $90 million to repair some terribly rundown schools in a working class neighborhood in Salinas, California. This was really inspiring. And then when I got asked to join the Obama campaign in 2008, that was one of the most inspiring experiences of my life. And so actually, for the first time in my life working on the Obama campaign, I found something that I found as deeply satisfying as way back I had always found music. Because in its own way, it was creative. And the idea of serving something so big and so important was every bit as inspiring as music had ever been.
Wow, yeah, that's a great story. Now, in no way to undermine it, it reminds me of a counterpoint that Pete Townsend made once. I remember he said he was dismissing all the kind of political activism in the 1980s and saying, "Tell me what's more important. What's changed the world more than a guitar?"
Well, yeah, I'm very sympathetic to both sides of that argument. Pete Townsend's one of my heroes. And I actually worked, in my own musical career. Of course, I have a lot of experience with, I was a guitar player, was my first instrument. And one of my jobs was working with Thomas Dolby at a company called Beatnik, running the creative department at Beatnik, which was a fascinating internet company.
Yeah, he was really cutting edge in the 1980s, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He's a brilliant person, and he's also one of my musical heroes. As it happens, it was such a thrill to get to work so closely with him, and also just a brilliant thinker. But I grew up with that feeling, that belief that a guitar could change the world, that music could change the world, which really dates to the 60s. And in many ways, unfortunately, it proved really not to be true. George Harrison, to cite another great 60s musical figure, once said, I think, that the summer of love lasted for about 5 minutes. And it very quickly got absorbed into the giant marketing machinery of the entertainment industry. And if you look at the difference between 60s idealism in the music business versus where we are now with things like Super Bowl halftime shows and American Idol, I actually mentioned this in my book, it's a very different situation. And I often feel actually that rock music and other forms of popular music have really just become vehicles of consumer culture. I have very mixed feelings about the music industry on that score.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating discussion in and of itself. But let's get to your book, because those issues are really interesting. And in fact, as you say, you do touch on them in your book. So let's start off with the basic fundamentals. What do you mean by two nations, and why is it important?
Right. Well, as I researched the history in connection with, to me, this incredible development of Donald Trump becoming elected president, I realized that the division that we're seeing now does go back to the beginning of the country. And I concluded that really the United States has never been united. And it's always actually been two nations occupying one territory. And the ultimate source of that division, I believe, dates to the Enlightenment of the 18th century. And the Enlightenment, of course, was the triumph of reason, as exemplified by Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu and John Locke. And the founders of the country, of the United States, explicitly based the design for the United States on Enlightenment principles of reason, including John Locke's social contract, which heavily influenced Jefferson in the writing of the Declaration of Independence and heavily influenced the Constitution. They assumed, it feels presumptuous to criticize the thinking of towering figures like the founders of the United States, but I think they made a fundamental mistake. They assumed that the triumph of reason was final and that they could create a new form of nation, the civic nation, meaning as a nation founded on a social contract instead of on ethnicity, basically, a tribal identity. And they assumed this was the path of history going forward. What they did not appreciate, I believe, was the strength of the Counter-Enlightenment. And the Counter-Enlightenment was the resistance movement to the Enlightenment. And it's almost been lost to history, at least as far as the average person is concerned. Scholars are certainly aware of it. But our education and our cultural tradition assumes that the Enlightenment is the worldview, essentially, that science tells us what's true, and we use facts and logic and reason to debate to solve disagreements, etc. The Counter-Enlightenment, and there were serious Counter-Enlightenment thinkers, argued that reason is a very small form of truth. Yes, it can tell you what's mathematically true or what's scientifically true, but it doesn't capture the incredible richness and complexity of real life. And for that, you need faith, tradition, art and culture, And yes, ethnic identity. Counter-Enlightenment thinkers believed there was something essential to being a German or being French or English or Italian or whatever that could not be, sort of dissolved into this universal set of principles describing human nature the way that you can have universal principles of physics or chemistry. So I believe it's the implications of these two worldviews are that you actually define truth differently and you define what the source of authority should be differently. And if you fast forward to the present day and you look at these arguments between pro-Trump and anti-Trump people, where they'll often report, my God, it's like the other person's living in a different reality. My conclusion is they are living in a different reality. So I'm somebody from the Enlightenment legacy, I'm a political liberal. So people like me will offer facts and logic to Trump supporters, for example, about the coronavirus pandemic, or about things the president has said that are obviously untrue and which are shown to be untrue by, videotaped evidence or written evidence, and find that it bounces off his supporters. Well, a lot of the explanation for that is whether they know it or not. I believe his supporters are operating within this counter-enlightenment worldview where loyalty to a leader in a sort of pre-enlightenment mode, it's more really from the Middle Ages and before, and faith, whether it's religious faith or just faith in intuition and tradition and ethnic identity and culture, will easily trump, so to speak, facts and logic. And that is a lot of, I think ultimately that's what's going on here. And it has many different aspects, but I think that's the sort of umbrella concept that captures how American history led us to this moment.
Yeah, I sympathize a lot with your argument and your journey as well, because I too, was educated and grew up in a big city. I was Toronto. And
I lived in Toronto for 7 years, I think, or more. I was in Toronto for quite a while.
I see your CBC background.
Yeah, that's a wonderful.
Yeah. I was there in the 70s and 80s, and I mentioned Pete Townsend. I remember when they did their final farewell concert at Maple Leaf Gardens. But I'm a musician.
I might have been at the same concert.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure we must have crossed paths at several points. And yeah, I grew up so much in a liberal consciousness, and the whole idea growing up was that conservatives are stupid,
right.
And that if you were at all concerned about humanity or books or anything. Cultural or artistic or of the higher faculties, then obviously you were a liberal, because conservatives, they liked sports and read the stupid newspapers, the tabloids, and there was this real entrenched prejudice and this looking down, and I was totally into that, and one of the things that postmodernism was interesting for me because it actually draws a lot on the Counter-Enlightenment, which a lot of people don't understand. And it's kind of been swept under the carpet, but definitely Foucault and Derrida and these thinkers were drawing on Counter-Enlightenment ideas. So that was introducing some stuff to me, like Nietzsche and other things. And then Camille Paglia in the 1980s, I just fell in love with her. I just love Camille Paglia. And she introduced me to the whole sort of decadence and romantic movement and this Counter-Enlightenment in the arts, and which we always knew. And in the music industry, for example, it's pervasive, but we don't really like even things like the pre-Christian traditions and the sort of occult symbols and all these things. Zeppelin and all their symbols and Jimmy Page with Aleister Crowley and all this stuff,
and Tolkien.
Tolkien, and it goes back to this, but it's kind of hidden. It's occulted. And then when I did my PhD, I read for my PhD at the University of Hull, and we had one of the country's leading conservative thinkers in the department. I was amazed. I just couldn't believe this whole world of thought, very, very interesting, and many of which you talk about in the book, was just sort of hidden from me. I never knew about, all the varieties of counter-enlightenment thought, particularly coming out of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
That was, it was not stupid in the least. I mean, it was, and it was extremely influential. And I felt really angry. I felt really angry that I was deprived of this exciting knowledge, in fact. And I don't know if you felt the same sort of
no, that's such an interesting. So that's so interesting. That really parallels my development a lot. And I remain a liberal, but I think a much more aware liberal. And I, like you, grew up with that set of assumptions that if once somebody became educated and freed their mind from prejudice and ignorance, of course they'd be a liberal. And it used to puzzle me that apparently intelligent, educated people were not liberals, and I wondered how could that possibly happen.
Yeah,
and I still run into this very frequently, and my fellow liberals are unaware, I think, the extent to which they actually themselves are living inside an intellectual and cultural bubble, and how they come across as incredibly arrogant. And we frequently hear this, and condescending. We frequently hear this from the right, and we arrogantly dismiss it. We essentially say, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. That's ridiculous."
Yes.
And when you hear stupid, hateful stuff coming from people on the right, it makes it easy to dismiss it, or bigoted and racist and all the worst of it. But the thing is, there are, as you say, very thoughtful people who are conservatives. I actually don't think Trumpism has much to do with classical conservatism. It's a ethno-nationalist populism, really. But when we hear there are intelligent conservatives who do draw on a counter-enlightenment tradition. It's certainly going back to Edmund Burke, who was horrified by the French Revolution as an example of, Enlightenment reason gone mad. And to that extent, at least, I agree with him. I mean, the Jacobins were horrible. And you're also right. I feel that all of us are drawn to the counter-enlightenment, even if we think of ourselves as Enlightenment thinkers. And once we start to look at the way we really think and what our actual assumptions and beliefs are, we realize that they're mutually contradictory in many ways. So those of us who believe in reason as the path to tolerance and inclusion and equality and democracy itself, ultimately, and I do believe in all those things, also have to take account of the fact that we love romantic poetry, and the Romantics were very much counter-Enlightenment figures. William Blake hated the Enlightenment.
Absolutely.
I thought it had produced the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout, as you say, the 60s counterculture with the reinvigoration of magic and tribalism, spirituality, drug taking in the search for transcendent experiences, and almost the fetishization of traditional tribalistic cultures, the romantic views of Native Americans or other Native cultures around the world, even, rock and roll. We were talking about rock music earlier. Well, that was essentially white people looking for some kind of counter-enlightenment connection to something more soulful. Right. And then we have a form of music, and I mentioned this in the book as well. There's a form of music called soul, which, as I say, was kind of named for what white people felt was missing from their culture.
Hello. If you enjoyed this clip, why not listen to the whole interview at newbooksnetwork.com, or you can check on the link in the description below. At newbooksnetwork.com, just search for Kirk Megu and you'll see all my interviews, including this one, in the topics of politics and polemics, and my special series on Malcolm X and Black nationalism, and also Third World nationalism. So check that out and let me know what you think. All right, take care and bye for now. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel here, and also subscribe on the New Books Network. Okay, take care. Bye.